They told me not to go downstairs, that the basement was just storage and nothing worth looking at. But the words they used had the weight of command, not care, and I heard it for what it was. A door that should never be opened. A line I was not meant to cross. I remember Elaine's voice, clipped and falsely light, as though she were talking to a child. "Stay upstairs, Mom. Rest your knee. You don't need to be wandering." "Rest," they said, as if I were a burden they had kindly taken in for a season. I am 78 years old, and I live alone now in a cramped apartment, with thin walls where the neighbors fight at night, and a leaking pipe keeps me company. But back then, I was fresh out of surgery, still limping, still dizzy from the medications that blurred my thoughts. Elaine, my only daughter, insisted I come live with her and her husband while I healed. I told myself it was generosity, that she was making room for me in her life after so many years of distance. But the truth settled faster than I wanted to admit. I wasn't a guest. I was a piece of furniture moved into a corner. Their house was modern, spotless, with white walls and pale oak floors that gleamed like no one had ever truly lived there. My room was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway, a guest room that smelled faintly of lavender detergent and cold air from a vent that rattled at night. There were no family photographs on the walls that included me, no framed moments from birthdays or holidays with my face in them. It was as if my existence had been carefully edited out of their story, and now I was just an old woman occupying temporary space, invisible unless I forgot my place. I tried to be grateful anyway, tried to fold myself neatly into their lives like a blanket you keep on the back of a sofa, pulled out only when needed. But gratitude curdled quickly when paired with silence and closed doors. The first time I heard something from the basement, I thought it was a trick of my imagination, a cough, low and human, rising through the vent while I was lying awake at 2 a.m, too restless to sleep. The next night I heard footsteps, deliberate and heavy, and then the distinct sound of something metal scraping against concrete. I asked Elaine about it over breakfast, forcing my voice to stay light, as though it were a joke, but she didn't look up from her phone. "Old houses make noises, Mom. It's just the pipes or the furnace." Her husband gave me a quick glance over the top of his glasses, the kind of look that isn't meant to reassure, but to warn. "Don't ask again." I swallowed my coffee and nodded, though the taste of unease lingered longer than the bitterness. It is strange how quickly you start doubting your own senses when the people around you insist you are wrong. I had always trusted my instincts, raised children, worked shifts at the hospital, kept a household running without complaint. But in that house, under their gaze, I began to feel like an unreliable narrator of my own life. They took my phone at night, saying they didn't want me to trip if I got up in the dark. They locked the front door with a keypad I didn't know the code for. They even rationed my medication, handing me pills one by one like I was a patient without the right to count for myself. And all the while, beneath the floorboards, the sounds continued, not constant but certain, a rhythm of life I was told not to acknowledge. One evening, when they thought I was asleep, I overheard them in the kitchen. Elaine's voice was hushed, urgent. "She asks too many questions." Her husband muttered something I couldn't catch, then louder. "She won't do anything. She doesn't even know what day it is half the time." The sting of that sentence burned deeper than I can describe. I knew exactly what day it was. I knew exactly who I was. And yet I realized they were building a story around me, a portrait of an old woman too confused to be believed. Once that story was in place, anything I said would be dismissed as paranoia. That was the night I stopped speaking out loud about the noises. I started keeping the knowledge to myself, writing little notes on scraps of paper, hiding them in the pages of a book I kept by my bed. The cruelty of it was not loud or obvious. It was quiet and constant, a steady erosion of dignity. They served me meals already plated, never allowing me to cook or even chop an onion, as if the kitchen were sacred ground forbidden to my hands. They corrected the way I sat in the living room, suggesting I take the smaller chair in the corner instead of the sofa. They monitored how long I spent in the shower, and every time I lingered near the basement door, Elaine's voice would rise, sharp with a sweetness that made my teeth ache. "Mom, really, nothing down there but boxes. Don't strain yourself." But her eyes flickered with something harder, something that told me there was more in that darkness than dust. I thought of my late husband, of how he used to say that the worst kind of violence was the kind no one else could see, the kind that made you doubt yourself, the kind that could pass for kindness if you weren't paying attention. He'd been gone 10 years, and yet I could almost hear him in the silence of that house, urging me not to accept what I was being fed. But the truth is, at 78, after surgery, after decades of being told to keep quiet, my courage felt brittle. I tried to convince myself it was better not to know, that whatever was in the basement belonged to them, not to me. Still, at night, when the house was dark and the sounds rose again, I would lie in bed with my hand pressed against the wall, listening, waiting for proof that I wasn't insane. I am telling you this now, years later, because what happened in that house was not madness or imagination. It was real, and it was dangerous, and it was the moment I understood just how easy it is for an old woman to disappear inside her own life. They thought they had written me out of the story, reduced me to someone fragile and forgetful. But I remember every detail. I remember the cold air drifting up the stairwell, carrying with it the scent of cigarettes when Elaine swore her husband had quit. I remember the creak of footsteps that didn't match their patterns of movement. And most of all, I remember the way my daughter looked at me, not with love, not with even irritation, but with calculation, as though I were a liability she needed to manage. So when I tell you that the police opened the basement door and I saw the truth, you will understand why it didn't surprise me as much as it should have. Shock is for those who live in denial, and I had stopped denying long before the flashing lights filled the driveway. But that part of the story comes later. For now, remember only this. They told me not to go downstairs, and I listened, not because I believed them, but because I was already preparing for the day someone else would. The moment that shifted everything did not arrive with thunder or drama, but with the softest of confirmations, the kind that slices more cleanly than any blade because it removes even the last shred of doubt. I had been hearing noises for weeks, but I told myself it was weakness, imagination, the side effects of painkillers. Then, one afternoon, when the house was unusually quiet and I was left alone while Elaine and her husband went to run errands, I decided to make a small rebellion. I would not go downstairs, not yet. But I would stand at the basement door and listen in the silence, without the television humming in the background or the sound of the blender masking everything real. I pressed my palm against the cool painted wood, leaned close to the seam where the frame met the door, and waited. It didn't take long. A cough, deep and unmistakably human, rose up to meet me, Then a shuffle of feet, the low thud of someone pacing on concrete, followed by the sound of water running. I stumbled back so quickly that I nearly lost my balance, clutching the railing of the stairs with my heart pounding, as though I were the one caught doing something forbidden. In that moment, the truth landed fully. There was someone living in that basement. The realization didn't bring clarity, only a sharper confusion, because the first question was not who, but why. Why would my daughter hide a person beneath her house? Why would she feed me stories of boxes and storage while a living, breathing human being existed below my feet? My mind flickered through possibilities with the stubborn logic of a nurse who once worked the night shift, trained to look for causes even when exhaustion made the world blur. Was it a tenant? Someone they were renting space to without telling the neighbors, a secret that embarrassed them? Was it a relative of her husband's, fallen on hard times and too proud to admit it? Or was it something darker? Something I couldn't yet name but could feel in the tightness of my chest. I tried to speak of it again at dinner that evening, careful and cautious, because I wanted to sound calm and credible. I waited until Elaine poured herself a glass of wine, until her husband sat down with the plate of salmon he had grilled to perfection, and then I said, lightly, "I thought I heard someone downstairs today. A man's voice." I expected denial, but what I received was worse. Dismissal wrapped in a thin film of kindness. Elaine laughed, not warmly, but sharply, the kind of laugh that says, "Oh, you poor thing. Mom, you've been on strong medication, and sometimes it can cause confusion. You know that." Her husband chimed in without looking at me, slicing his salmon into neat pieces. Old houses echo. You hear one thing and think it's another. They didn't even bother to look concerned, which told me they had prepared for this moment. They had anticipated my discovery and had their lines ready, rehearsed like actors in a play. The cruelty of that performance was more piercing than the cough itself, because it told me they had no intention of acknowledging the truth, no intention of including me in the reality of that household. I was to be contained, managed, soothed into silence. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, the ceiling above me glowing faintly from the street lamp outside, and I replayed the moment at the dinner table again and again, the clipped tones, the sideways glances between them. They were aligned against me, and I realized with a shudder that whatever they were hiding, they needed me to be the unreliable witness. That was the true betrayal, not the locked door, but the way my daughter looked at me as if I were already fading, a woman whose words carried no weight. The following day, I received what I can only call confirmation in print. I was searching through the drawer of the side table in the living room, looking for a pen, when I found a receipt crumpled at the back. It was from a hardware store, dated just 3 days earlier, addressed to this very home. On the list of purchases were items that chilled me: extension cords, a padlock, canned goods, heavy-duty trash bags, bottled water in bulk. At the bottom, the name was not my son-in-law's, not Elaine's, but someone I did not know, a name scratched in hurried handwriting. My hands trembled as I held the slip of paper, my throat tightening as though the air itself had become thinner. This was no accident. Whoever lived below was supplied, supported, hidden with intention. I kept the receipt tucked into the pocket of my cardigan, a talisman and a piece of proof in a house where truth was constantly rewritten. That night, I did not confront them. I had learned enough to know that speaking too soon would only deepen their story about my confusion. Instead, I listened. When the house settled into silence, I crept down the hallway and sat on the top step of the stairs that led to the basement door. I stayed there for what must have been an hour, the air colder near the bottom of the house, my joints aching from sitting still. Then, with my heart hammering, I tapped once on the wooden floor beneath me. A pause followed, long enough that I thought I had imagined the whole thing, and then a sound came back, faint but undeniable. A knock in answer. I nearly wept from the force of it. Not fear, not yet, but the weight of being confirmed, of knowing I had not imagined, not invented, not confused the shadows of an old house. There was life down there, life that responded to me, life that was waiting for something I could not yet guess. I returned to my room without a word, but I did not sleep. Every rustle of the sheets, every creak of the house seemed magnified, and I realized for the first time that I was not merely living in discomfort or disrespect. I was living inside a secret I had not agreed to carry. The catalyst was not the sound, not the cough, not even the knock that answered mine. The catalyst was the understanding that my own daughter had chosen to build her safety, her marriage, her life around a lie so thick that I was expected to drown quietly in it. She did not want a mother in her home. She wanted a witness she could discredit, a woman too weary to insist on what she saw, someone easy to explain away. That was the day I began to imagine an end to the silence, the day I realized that one way or another the door would be opened, and when it was, the world would see not only who lived below, but also who had pushed me above into a cage of quiet. And so, the betrayal was complete. Not just exclusion, not just secrecy, but the rewriting of me into a figure of pity, someone whose words carried no truth. I had been erased before my very eyes, and the cruelest part was that it was my daughter's hand on the eraser. I looked at her across the breakfast table the next morning, her hair shining, her smile perfectly practiced as she asked about my pain levels, and I thought, "You do not see me, but I see you." That was the beginning of everything that followed, the moment when the story shifted from unease to danger, when my suspicions hardened into certainty. They thought I was too frail to understand. They were wrong. In the days that followed, the silence of that house grew heavier. Not because anything new had happened, but because I finally knew for certain what I had suspected. And knowledge changes the air you breathe. Once you are sure of something, every ordinary act takes on the quality of performance, and I began to notice how carefully Elaine and her husband managed me. They no longer asked casually about my knee or whether I wanted tea. Instead, they filled the spaces of conversation with instructions, with careful boundaries wrapped in politeness. "Don't strain yourself, Mom. Just stay upstairs." Or, "I'll get that for you, Mom. No need to fuss." It might have sounded like kindness to an outsider, but after years of living as a woman who could see through tone, I recognized the warning beneath their words. They weren't worried about my health. They were worried about my curiosity. And as the days slipped into one another, their control over my world became quieter but tighter, like a hand slowly tightening its grip on a shoulder, not enough to bruise, but enough to remind you not to move. I began to measure my life in small humiliations. I was no longer trusted to pour myself a cup of coffee without someone hovering nearby to add sugar, as though I might spill or forget how to stir. My clothes were taken to the laundry without my asking, returned folded, but smelling of a detergent I disliked. And when I tried to wash a blouse myself, Elaine appeared in the doorway, frowning. saying it was better if I didn't risk slipping near the machines. They spoke about me in the third person while I was still in the room, as if I were not present at all. She doesn't sleep well at night, or she's been a little confused about time. Each sentence landed like a nail hammered into the coffin of my credibility, and I sat quietly while they built that coffin word by word. Even the neighbors seemed to know the script, greeting me with the over-patient voices people reserve for children, and the senile, because clearly that was how I had been introduced. Not as a mother, not as a woman, but as someone fragile, someone unreliable. The basement itself became more alive in its silence. There were nights when I would wake to the sound of water rushing through pipes at odd hours, too late for a shower, too early for laundry, and I realized someone below was living by a clock that did not match ours. I smelled cigarette smoke drifting up through the vents, a stale scent that caught in my throat, and I remembered my son-in-law boasting years ago that he had quit. I would sit on the edge of my bed and listen, straining for details. The scrape of a chair, the faint hum of a television, once even the sound of a man's voice humming tunelessly in the dark. These were not echoes or tricks. These were signs of life, of routine, of habitation. And yet, when I looked at the locked door at the bottom of the stairs, painted the same white as the rest of the house, I saw not just a barrier, but a declaration that I had been deemed unworthy of the truth. I began writing things down. At first, just single words: cough, knock, receipt. Then longer notes, observations about when the noises came, what time the lights flickered faintly under the basement door, how often my daughter carried down bags of groceries late at night. I hid these notes between the pages of an old Bible I kept in my nightstand, because I knew if I said them out loud, they would be dismissed. But written down, they became proof for myself. It was my way of fighting the erosion, reminding myself that I was still sane, still capable of observing and recording the world with clarity. There is a particular kind of violence in being told that your senses lie, and I refuse to surrender mine without resistance. The first escalation was not a dramatic event, but the tightening of the cage around me. My access to the outside world was quietly restricted. Elaine began insisting that she take my phone to charge it overnight. But when she returned it in the morning, I noticed calls from old friends had gone unanswered, texts never opened. When I asked about it, she smiled too brightly and said, "Oh, Mom, you probably just pressed the wrong buttons." They discouraged me from walking in the neighborhood, reminding me that my knee was delicate, that strangers might not be friendly, that it was better to rest indoors. The front door keypad remained a mystery. When I asked for the code, my son-in-law joked, "Top secret," as though it were a matter of national security. It became clear that the only world I was allowed to inhabit was the upstairs hallway, the bedroom, and the carefully orchestrated family dinners, where my silence was more welcome than my stories. And still, every day, the signs of the hidden life below grew clearer. Delivery boxes appeared on the porch, with labels peeled off before I could glance at them. Once, Elaine carried a large pot of stew down the stairs and returned empty-handed, brushing her hair from her face with the look of someone performing a chore she resented but had accepted as necessary. I tried to catch her eye, but she avoided mine, setting the empty pot in the sink with a clatter. That night, I wrote in my notes, "She feeds him too." The word him came naturally, though I had no proof beyond the weight of the voice I had heard. The cruelest detail of those weeks was the way they made me complicit by silence. If I obeyed, if I kept quiet, I was safe in my little room with my meals and my chair by the window. If I resisted, I risked being painted as unstable, perhaps even moved into a facility where my words would be worth even less. They had set the stage so carefully that any attempt to tell the truth would sound like the ramblings of a frightened old woman. And perhaps that was the point all along. To make me invisible, so that no matter what I saw or heard, the world would never believe me. But invisibility sharpens you in ways you don't expect. I learned to watch the smallest details, the way Elaine's hand trembled when she unlocked the basement door, the way my son-in-law always lingered near me if I walked too close to the stairs, the way the house seemed to hold its breath when something shifted below. I learned to time their patterns, to know when they were distracted enough for me to lean near the door, to listen for the rhythm of someone else's life being lived under our feet. The escalation was not in the noises themselves, but in the way the walls of the house seemed to close tighter each day, pressing me into silence while something hidden thrived just beyond my reach. There is a loneliness in being erased that is unlike any other. You sit at a table where no one asks you questions, where every sentence you attempt is interrupted or redirected, and you begin to feel as though your voice no longer belongs to you. That was how I felt in those weeks, erased in plain sight, existing only as a shape in the corner, while my daughter and her husband built a story in which I was nothing more than a fragile burden. But I was watching, always watching, and I wrote it all down. Because I knew, even then, that the time would come when those notes would be the difference between madness and proof, between silence and a voice that could no longer be denied. And so, the first escalation was not a scream or a confrontation, but a quiet war of attrition. They pushed me further into invisibility, and I clung stubbornly to the truth I carried, refusing to let it be stolen. They thought I was pliable, manageable, dissolving into confusion. They thought wrong. The shift began on an afternoon so ordinary that no one watching from outside would have noticed a thing. But for me, it was the moment something inside turned. The day I decided I could not keep living as the quiet ghost of that house. Elaine had gone to work. Her husband was out running errands, and the silence pressed against me in a way that felt almost daring, as though the walls themselves were offering me a chance to move without being seen. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea, staring at the faint pattern on the linoleum floor, and I realized that if I did nothing, I would disappear completely into the role they had written for me. The thought of being erased while alive filled me with a sharper terror than the noises from the basement ever had. I stood, slowly, my knee aching but steady enough, and began to move through the house with deliberate care, as though claiming the space with my steps. It was the first time in weeks that I allowed myself to feel like I belonged in any room other than my assigned corner upstairs. I ended up in the living room, where the heavy curtains were drawn even in the middle of the day, muting the light until the air itself seemed secretive. I walked to the small cabinet near the television, a place I had never opened before, and slid the drawer out. Inside were envelopes stacked neatly, each marked with dates, some unopened. I rifled carefully, my fingers trembling, until one of the envelopes caught my eye. It was a bill for the utilities, the kind I had managed for decades when I still had a home of my own. Only this one was strange. The charges for water and electricity were far higher than they should have been for a household of 2 adults, a child, and an old woman. The usage was almost double what I remembered paying even when my children were still at home, and the washer never stopped running. I traced the figures with my fingertip, and in that moment, the puzzle slid into focus. There was someone else in that house consuming water, using power, taking up air and food, and yet they were officially invisible. I tucked the envelope back exactly as I had found it and sat down on the sofa, my body trembling, not with fear, but with clarity. It was no longer a suspicion. It was proof, the kind that could not be explained away by pipes or echoes or confusion. I felt a surge of something I had not felt in months, the raw heat of agency. For weeks I had been folded small, waiting for others to tell me what was real, but now I had evidence that my senses had been right all along. The betrayal stung, but beneath the sting was a sharp edge of strength, the realization that I was not crazy, not mistaken, and not yet broken enough to be discarded. That was the midpoint of my story, the place where silence stopped being survival and became a choice I would no longer accept. That evening, when Elaine returned, she found me sitting in the kitchen, upright, my notebook open in front of me. She glanced at it, at the pages filled with my careful handwriting, and her expression faltered for just a moment. "What are you writing, Mom?" she asked, her voice too casual, too sweet. "Just notes," I replied evenly. "I like to keep track of things." She nodded quickly, forced a smile, and busied herself with unpacking groceries. But I saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands moved faster than usual. In that instant, I knew she was aware that I was aware, and the balance of the household shifted. She could no longer rely on my silence as proof of my weakness. That night, I sat on the top step of the basement stairs again, clutching the handrail with one hand and the notebook with the other. I tapped softly on the floor, once, twice. A pause followed, and then, like before, a faint answering knock. But this time, I did not retreat in fear. Instead, I whispered, barely audible, "I hear you." I knew the person below could not hear my words, but saying them aloud was for me, a declaration that I would no longer deny the truth. My heart pounded with the exhilaration of rebellion, a rebellion no one else would have seen, but which mattered more than any loud defiance. I returned to my room with the strange calm of someone who has made a decision, though she has not yet spoken it out loud. The following morning, I took my first act of independence in months. I dressed carefully, put on my coat, and walked to the front door while Elaine was in the shower. I did not know the keypad code, but I remembered the back door to the garden, the one they never bothered to lock because the yard was fenced. I slipped out quietly, the cold air rushing over me like a baptism, and I walked down the block, my knee aching with each step, but my resolve firm. At the corner, I saw Mrs. Carter, the neighbor who always watered her flowers even in the chill, and I forced myself to smile and say hello. It felt monumental, simply speaking to another human being without permission, and when she asked how I was settling in, I told her the truth in a single careful sentence. Sometimes it's difficult when you feel like a guest in your own daughter's house. She nodded sympathetically, probably thinking nothing more of it, but for me it was a seed planted, proof that my voice still existed outside their walls. When I returned, Elaine was already waiting, her hair damp, her arms crossed. "Where did you go?" she asked, her tone sharp. I held her gaze and answered calmly, "Just a walk. I needed air." She opened her mouth to scold, but then something in my face must have stopped her, because she closed it again and said nothing. That silence was a victory, small but powerful, and it carried me through the rest of the day. The shift was not about escape yet, nor about confrontation. It was about reclaiming the smallest fragments of power, the choice to leave the house, the decision to write down the truth, the refusal to be gaslit into doubting my own eyes and ears. In those moments, I began to feel a version of myself I thought I had lost. The woman who once managed a household, who once stayed awake through night shifts, who once held together a life with nothing but grit and stubborn will. That woman had been buried under polite dismissals and the slow erosion of trust. But she was still there, and she was stirring. That night, when I lay down in the narrow bed that had always felt like a cage, I looked at the ceiling and felt something loosen in my chest. I was not waiting anymore. I was watching, preparing, gathering the strength I would need for what came next. The midpoint of my story was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet turn inward, the moment I stopped being their silent shadow and began, in my own way, to move toward the light of my own truth. The second escalation began not with a loud event, but with a subtle tightening, as though the house itself sensed that I had shifted and responded by trying to cage me more firmly. My daughter had always been quick to notice small changes in my behavior, and when I started walking outside again, keeping my notebook in plain sight, even asking a question too directly at the dinner table, her eyes sharpened, her smile thinned, and the weight of her presence pressed heavier on me. She was no longer merely dismissing me. She was studying me, calculating whether I had become a danger to the fragile arrangement they had constructed. And in that tension, the past began to stir, pressing against the present in ways I could no longer ignore. The first tangible sign came in the form of a letter. I had gone to bring in the mail while Elaine was still at work, an act she usually reserved for herself, but the mailbox was not locked and the day was bright. So I moved slowly down the driveway, my knee aching but steady. Inside the thin stack of envelopes was one addressed to me in a familiar scrawl. My heart jolted at the sight of it, because I recognized the handwriting instantly. My grandson, Michael, the only one of Elaine's children who ever bothered to call me when he was away at college. I carried the envelope upstairs to my room and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at it for long minutes before tearing it open. Inside was a simple note. Grandma, I don't know what's happening, but Mom doesn't let me talk to you on the phone anymore. I miss you. Are you okay? Please write back. His words, halting and uncertain, cut through the fog of weeks spent doubting my own voice, and I realized that even outside the walls of that house, the story was being controlled. My own grandson believed I was inaccessible because of me, not because of them. I tucked the letter into my notebook and felt a kind of fury bloom in me, slow but steady, the kind of fury that comes not from one betrayal, but from the accumulation of small erasures. I had been silenced within the house, and now they were reaching beyond it, stealing even the voices of those who loved me. That night at dinner, I looked at Elaine and her husband with new eyes, and I understood that I was no longer simply inconvenient. I was dangerous to them because I carried the power of memory, of recognition, of truth written in my own hand. They needed me erased not only within their walls but in the wider world, and that realization set the stage for what followed. The noises from the basement grew louder, or perhaps I simply paid more attention now that I had allowed myself to believe them. I heard a television once, a muffled burst of voices and laughter, cut short as though someone had realized it was too loud. I smelled food cooking that no one upstairs had prepared, spices that lingered faintly in the air vents long after the kitchen had gone cold. And late one night, when I pressed my ear to the floor at the top of the basement stairs, I heard words, spoken low and hurried, a man's voice asking, "How much longer?" The response I could not catch, but the desperation in the tone was enough. There was not just a hidden life below, but a hidden tension, something unsustainable, something on the verge of spilling over. My act of quiet rebellion came 2 days later, when Elaine left for work and her husband was gone longer than usual. I crept downstairs, my body trembling not just from age, but from the enormity of the risk, and I placed my ear directly against the basement door. For long minutes there was nothing, only silence so thick I wondered if I had imagined it all again. Then, a scrape of metal, the sound of movement close on the other side, and a breath. A human breath, so close I felt as if it were touching me through the wood. I knocked once, softly. This time the response came faster. 3 quick knocks, deliberate, like a code. I whispered, "Who are you?" There was no answer, but the silence that followed was charged, filled with the knowledge that I had crossed a boundary no one wanted me to cross. I retreated upstairs, my legs shaking, and when Elaine returned that evening, she looked at me too closely, as though she could read the truth on my face. From that moment, their behavior changed. They stopped leaving me alone for long stretches. Elaine's husband began working from home more often, his presence filling the house like a guard's shadow. Elaine grew sharper in her tone, correcting me more openly, her voice less sweet and more impatient, as though she no longer cared to maintain the illusion of kindness. They began rationing my movements even more strictly, suggesting I take my meals upstairs in my room, telling me I needed rest, insisting the stairs were too dangerous for me. It was clear. They suspected I had discovered too much. The walls of the house pressed closer, but so did my resolve. The past pressed in through memory, uninvited but unavoidable. I remembered the years when Elaine was a child, how fiercely protective I had been, how I worked double shifts at the hospital so she could have new clothes for school, how I hid my own hunger so she could eat. I remembered the night she came home crying from a broken heart, and I stayed up until dawn, making her tea and listening, holding her like the world itself would break if I let go. Those memories clashed violently with the woman standing before me now, her arms crossed, her eyes hard, telling me I was confused, that I should stay quiet, that I should trust her. I wanted to believe that somewhere inside her, the girl I raised still existed, but the weight of what she was hiding crushed that hope. She had chosen her secrets over her mother, and that choice was irreversible. The escalation deepened when Elaine confronted me directly. It was late evening, the house quiet, and she appeared at my bedroom door without knocking, stepping inside with a coldness I had never seen before. "Mom," she said, her voice flat. "You've been acting strange, writing things down, going for walks without telling me, asking questions that don't make sense. I need you to understand something. This is my house. You're here because we're helping you. And if you make things difficult, I don't know how much longer that can last." The threat was not subtle, and I felt my breath catch in my chest. She wasn't warning me for my safety. She was warning me for hers. I nodded, said nothing, and she left. But my heart pounded for hours afterward. It was in that state of fear and determination that I made the call. Not to a family member, not to a friend, but to the non-emergency police line. I waited until Elaine left her phone on the counter and went upstairs to bathe, and I took the cordless from the kitchen into the laundry room, closing the door softly behind me. My hand shook as I dialed, but my voice was steady when the dispatcher answered. "There's someone living in my daughter's basement," I said. "Someone not supposed to be there." The words felt like stepping off a cliff. The dispatcher asked questions, and I answered as calmly as I could. The address, the noises, the receipts, the signs I had collected. I could hear the doubt in her tone, the careful patience reserved for calls from the elderly, but she promised someone would check. I hung up quickly, my pulse racing, and returned to my room before Elaine could notice. The waiting was the worst part. Every sound in the house became sharper. Every moment stretched thin with the fear that Elaine or her husband would discover what I had done. But when the police arrived the next evening, knocking firmly at the door while the neighbors peeked from their windows, the world I had been suffocating in cracked open. Elaine tried to smile, tried to wave them off with her charm, but the officers were insistent. They asked questions, firm and direct, and when she faltered, when her husband stammered, they requested to see the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest as the door was unlocked at last. The air that rushed up was cold and stale, and behind it came the sound of movement, undeniable now, undeniable to everyone. That was the second escalation. Not the moment the truth was fully revealed, but the moment the world was forced to see what I had known all along. The house was no longer just theirs, no longer a cage built of silence and dismissal. It was a crime scene, a stage where their secrets could not be hidden. And as the officers descended the stairs, and I heard the sharp command of voices rising from below, I knew the story I had carried alone was no longer mine to bear in silence. When the police descended into the basement, the silence of the house cracked like thin glass under a sudden weight, and though I could not see past the line of their shoulders, I heard everything: the scrape of shoes on the concrete, the sharp beam of a flashlight cutting into the dark, the murmur of one officer to another, and then the unmistakable sound of a man's voice rising up, hoarse and startled, not defiant, but weary with the strain of hiding. My heart seemed to stop, and for a moment I clutched the banister as though the entire world had tilted. Elaine stood frozen by the kitchen counter, her face drained of color, her hands twisting together in a frantic knot, while her husband hovered by the door as if considering whether to run. I could not move, only listen as the voice grew louder, and then the words were clear. "I thought you said she knew." That sentence sliced through me more deeply than anything else, because in it was the confirmation that I had not only been deceived, but used, presented as the silent witness, the confused old woman upstairs who could be counted on to say nothing, or, if she did speak, would not be believed. The officers brought him up after a few minutes that felt like hours. He was taller than I expected, gaunt and hollow-eyed, dressed in clothes that looked worn down by nights spent in shadows. His hands were cuffed, but he did not fight. He looked at me with something like pity, something almost apologetic, and for one strange moment I wondered if he, too, had been trapped, just in a different way. Behind him came two officers carrying boxes, and in those boxes were the pieces of the life that had been hidden below me. Canned goods stacked in careful rows, a thin mattress stained with use, blankets that smelled faintly of mildew, and a television set with the cords hastily unplugged. The house, so spotless above, had been sheltering a secret that smelled of dust, sweat, and desperation. Elaine tried to speak then, her voice breaking as she turned to the officers, saying, "It's not what it looks like. I was just helping him. He had nowhere else to go." But her words cracked under the weight of evidence, and even she seemed to know they carried no strength. Her husband spoke louder, angrier, insisting that they were being harassed, that this was a misunderstanding, but his voice trembled at the edges. The officers ignored them both, firm and practiced, reading rights, making notes, asking me questions directly for the first time. And when they turned to me and said, "Ma'am, how long have you been aware of someone living in the basement?" I felt something shift inside me, something sharp and clear, the sound of my own voice cutting through the narrative they had tried so hard to bury. "I heard him weeks ago," I said, steady, louder than I had expected my voice could be. "I told my daughter, but she said I was imagining it. I wrote it down, every night, every sound, every sign." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my notebook, its pages filled with my cramped handwriting, each word a testament to my sanity. I handed it to the officer, my hand trembling, but not from fear. And in that moment, I felt the weight lift, not completely, but enough to let me stand straighter. Elaine looked at me then with a kind of horror, not because of the police or the man in cuffs, but because I had refused to stay in the role she had written for me. The scene stretched into the night, the flashing lights outside casting strange shadows on the walls, neighbors gathered in clumps on the sidewalk, whispering, watching. I saw Mrs. Carter among them, her mouth slightly open, her face pale in the glow, and I wondered what she thought of the woman who had once smiled politely at her flowers, now standing at the center of scandal. The officers asked more questions, took photographs, and at last led both Elaine and her husband away, their faces pale and tight with a mixture of anger and shame. I stood at the doorway, clutching the frame for balance, and watched them being placed into separate cars. Elaine looked at me once more, her eyes filled with a fury that wanted to burn me down, but beneath it, I saw fear, the kind that comes from realizing control has been shattered. I did not look away. When the door closed and the house was empty except for me and the fading echo of voices, I sat down at the kitchen table, my body trembling from exhaustion, my heart pounding with the enormity of what had just unfolded. For years, I had been dismissed, silenced, treated as though my words were worth nothing. And yet here, in the wreckage of their deceit, it was my voice that had mattered. The man in the basement had been real. The danger had been real. And the fragile shell of their perfect life had broken under the weight of the truth I refused to surrender. The climax was not just the sight of handcuffs or the flashing of police lights. It was the reclamation of myself, the moment when the world was forced to hear me, to recognize that I was not fragile, not confused, not invisible. Later, when the officers had left and the house was finally still, I walked to the basement door, still ajar, and looked down the stairs. The air that rose to meet me was damp and sour, carrying with it the residue of secrets too long hidden. I did not go down. I had no desire to step into the shadows they had created, but I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark and whispered softly, "It's over." Not to him, not to Elaine, but to myself. A benediction. A closing of the chapter that had nearly swallowed me whole. The climax of my story was not an explosion, not a violent confrontation. But the moment the silence was broken, the moment my truth was heard and believed, it was the sound of the door opening, the sight of the hidden man brought into the light, the steady strength of my own voice carrying across the room. And in that, I understood something I had forgotten, that even after years of being diminished, even after months of being erased, I still carried the power to name what was real, and no one could take that from me again. I moved out before the echo of the last siren faded, not because anyone asked me to go, but because I understood that the house had been emptied of anything that could still belong to me, and there is a kind of mercy in leaving a stage once the play has ended. I packed my clothes and the notebook, folded the letter from my grandson into my wallet, slipped the spare photograph of my husband into the liner of my purse, and took a ride across town to a narrow building with peeling paint and a vacancy sign like a tired smile, where the landlord with the soft belly and careful eyes handed me a key and said the rent was due on Fridays. I paid in cash, the way I did when I was young and certain, and when I opened the door to the small apartment, it smelled of old wood and sun-warmed dust, and instead of thinking of everything it lacked, I stood still and listened to what it had to offer, which was quiet, and the slow, honest creak of floorboards that tell the truth about being walked on. I bought a second-hand couch the color of rainwater, and a kettle with a whistle loud enough to insist on being heard, and when I boiled water for tea that first evening, I realized how long it had been since I stood in a room that answered only to me, a room where no one edited my movements or measured my voice, where I could leave the spoon in the sink and the book open on the table, and the world would not rearrange itself under someone else's preference. In the mornings, I learned the rhythm of the block, the mailman's shuffle at 10, the child on the third floor banging his backpack against the railing, the florist across the street, trimming stems in a bucket that turned the water emerald, and I found that routine, once the chain that tethered me in my daughter's house, became a gentle rope I could hold as I stepped into the unfamiliar fact of my freedom. My knee steadied, my sleep returned, and without the nightly calculation of which sounds were real and which would be denied, my mind remembered its old clarity, the way a lake settles once the stones stop being thrown into it. And on a Tuesday that tasted like spring, I sat at the small table by the window and wrote a letter I had no intention of mailing, not to the officers or the neighbors or to the man who had lived under my feet, but to Elaine. And I kept my words plain and steady, because I had learned that fury, however justified, is too easy a fire to warm your hands around forever. I wrote that I knew what she had chosen, and that choice did not need my forgiveness to be complete, that I would not stand in the doorway of her life waiting to be invited or blamed, that I was not fragile glass to be wrapped in the story of someone else's convenience, and that the part of me she tried to misplace had found herself again and would not be returning to the shelf. When I finished, I folded the paper twice and slid it behind the photograph inside my dresser, a small talisman against forgetting. And then I picked up the phone and called my grandson. And when he answered with that cracked rush of breath that belongs to relief, I told him where I was and how the light looked on my curtains and what the tea tasted like. And he told me about a bookshop that had hired him for the summer, and a poem he could not shake from his mind. And we did not speak about court dates or headlines or the neighbors' faces, because there are conversations you only have when you are willing to pick up the rope of the past and pull. And that day, we both chose to stand in the present and let it hold. The papers came and went, as papers always do. one week casting me as a mystery, and the next as a cautionary tale. And then, like all news that does not involve explosions or celebrities, they stopped caring. But the woman at the corner grocer began offering me the bruised peaches for free, and the superintendent fixed my leaky pipe the day I mentioned it, and a sparrow started building a nest behind the cable junction on my balcony. And those small graces proved more durable than apology. I bought a bird feeder with a red roof because the color pleased me, and I spent afternoons learning which seeds grateful finches prefer, and I did not pretend that the ache had vanished, because love, even damaged love, has weight. It settles into the muscles and only leaves in pieces. But I discovered that grief needs space to lie down and stop clawing, and the little apartment gave it a clean patch of floor and a window with a view, and in return it left me my mornings, my appetite, my laugh, my stubborn belief that life can arrive late and still be on time. On a Sunday, I walked past the old house on my way to the bus and did not turn my head, and later I wrote to a legal aid clinic with a simple sentence about reassurance, not revenge, and the woman who called me back had a voice sturdy as a porch and told me she had seen this pattern before, that I was not an exception to the rule of how people try to shrink the elderly until they fit into their convenience. And somehow, hearing the shape of my story in someone else's mouth loosened the last knot inside my chest. And I slept that night with the window cracked, the city air moving in and out like a tide I no longer fought. If you ask me what peace looks like at my age, I will tell you it is not triumphant or loud. It is the steadiness of your own name in your own handwriting, the cup you like set in the cupboard where your hand reaches naturally, the decision to answer the phone only when you wish and not because someone's worry has been weaponized into a leash, the right to sit with the past without being dragged by it down a set of forbidden stairs. And if I had to choose a single proof that I am no longer lost, it would be this. I have stopped rehearsing what I will say if I am ever asked to explain myself, because explanation is an offering to doubt, and I have nothing left to trade. To the woman who might be reading this in a kitchen that does not listen to her, who keeps her notes in a book because her voice isn't welcome at the table, who has been told she mishears and misremembers and misunderstands, I am telling you that the door opened for me only after I stopped begging for permission to be credible, that the world did not hand me courage as a gift, but returned it like a misplaced belonging once I kept insisting it was mine, that you are not wrong to believe what your bones know in the dark, and that there is a life waiting on the other side of the hallway, made of thrift store couches and whistling kettles and neighbors who learn your name by the way you greet the morning birds. A life small enough to hold without trembling and large enough to carry your whole heart without negotiation. They hid a stranger in my basement until the police opened the door, but the stranger I rescued was the woman who refused to disappear, and she is the one who sits here now, older and lighter, stirring sugar into her tea and looking out at the sky the color of linen, ready to bless the day and anyone who needs the blessing. Do not wait for someone else to testify on your behalf. Do not wait for the sirens to declare you real. Listen to the tap under your ribs. Answer it back, and walk toward the room where your voice fits the walls.